And hello once again to another of these lecture video things that I do. My name is artsy Lupus, and today I'm going to be looking at post-colonial theatre and sort of post-colonialism in general, post-colonial literature rather, and what you can do with it. You know, very, very fun old times. Before we get into all that though, if you appreciate these videos that I make, you can always support me by checking out some of my books or going onto my Patreon and supporting me there. But we are going to move on to the video now. So, post-colonial theatre. Basically, post-colonial theatre is something that is anything that is in response to colonialism. Now, post-colonialism doesn't actually mean after colonialism. It means a response to colonialism. There were post-colonial texts very much sort of being created during colonialism, and we actually are still in a colonial phase, so we are still in colonialism, but different kind of colonialism. That's why we're going to get into this little idea of what is the difference between colonialism, very good at language, post-colonialism, and neo-colonialism. So colonialism is basically the act of colonizing places, which would be colonizing forces such as a lot of Europe going into other countries, taking over their land, basically setting themselves up as the government and not allowing autonomy within that space, and it basically being forced to be, say the British Empire, saying, you are now part of the British Empire, you are now, strictly speaking, British citizens, we have control over you, you do not have control over your own space, your own country, your own economy, your own anything, etc., etc. That is colonialism, right? It has a very, very long history. And we also tend to have this, because colonialism has actually existed for forever, but we usually think of the colonialism that was kind of in the last couple hundred years. That's what we usually think of when we think of colonialism. But when colonialism happens so long ago that it becomes integrated into culture, we seem to not think of it as colonialism anymore. For instance, a lot of Europe has this absolute fixation, fascination, love affair with ancient Rome, and ancient Rome were very much colonizers. They came in, they murdered anyone who stood against them, and set themselves up as the rulers, which is very, very, very fun, obviously, as you could tell, but because it was so long ago, people now are like, oh yeah, no, they were great, even though they were not. So colonialism is that. Post-colonialism is a response to colonialism, which is not necessarily the same as anti-colonialism. Post-colonialism is generally anti-colonial, but there are certain academic differentiations between sort of anti-colonialism in general and post-colonialism, but we're not going to look at it in that particular sense. We're going to be looking at it in a very, very broad sense, not in a very specified sense where you can, where it's overly academic. We're going to be looking at this as more just something that is against colonialism, etc. And then, as the last thing, neo-colonialism. Neo means new, so new colonialism. That is basically the colonialism that happens now, where we don't call it colonial. We're not colonizers. We're not like colonizers just because we forced you to conform to certain international they're international. They're not just us. We did create them, but yes, you do have to have a neoliberal economy, or else you will not be allowed to trade with other countries. That's not us enforcing our will on you. It's not like we're... Anyway, so basically, neocolonialism is like a modern form of colonialism where you don't control the country by going in there with guns and taking over. You don't do that. Instead, you put pressure on them through economics, or if they refuse to conform to that, you just tell the CIA to institute an uprising and then put a fascist government in control, rather, who will be, more likely to want to play ball with other capitalist countries. That's what you do. That's more neo-colonial stuff, right? You're not going to have America actually going in and trying to take over another country. That would be ridiculous. They'll just send people in secretly to do it. That's part of the sort of neo-colonial project, which is a much more pervasive and also more insidious in many ways, because basically they're pretending that they're not colonizers when they very much are colonizers. So the idea that colonialism has ended is nonsense. Just that old form of colonialism has ended because it's bad optics. You're not going to go in and try and take over a country through force. When that happens, you end up getting the entire world hating you. So, it's not a good idea if you want to look good. But it does still exist. So basically, post-colonial theatre is very much still very relevant now because colonialism has never ended. Just an old form of it has ended. So very broadly, you can see post-colonial theatre as a means of dismantling imperialist ideologies, right? So imperialism is basically colonial mentality, right? The idea of coming in and taking over. So the idea of post-colonial theatre and post-colonial works in general is an attempt to push against this. So some major topics that will be explored in post-colonial theatre and literature in general, things like colonization in general. What are the effects of colonization? What is colonization? What is the history of colonization? What did colonization do to people? What did colonization do to various people? And that's where you get into the idea of the colonizer versus the colonized. You get various people who have interrogated this relationship. Albert Memmi wrote a book basically about exactly this, the effects that colonialism has on both the colonizer and the colonized. You get lots of books that are from the perspective of the colonizer, and lots that are from the perspective of the colonized. You get also a lot of the ones that are from the perspective of the colonizer are ones that are more gung-ho about colonialism being a good thing, but you also get ones that aren't. Things like the works of J.M. Coetzee, which tend to fixate on the colonizer party, or at least the person who has the most privilege, and how they reconcile their existence with a fundamentally oppressive world in which they are not the oppressed. Are they a part of it because they're benefiting from it, etc., etc. These are, and then obviously so that's the side you can look at it from a colonizer perspective, and from a colonized perspective, you actually look at the oppression and how it affects the person itself, the actual colonized people. So, post-colonial theatre does not only focus on the colonized people, it also will look at the colonizers. What are the effects it has on both of these groups, right? Because the effects are very negative on both, right? I would say worse on the colonized, but definitely an effect on both. So that is something to keep in mind, that post-colonial theatre and other literature will look at this kind of relationship and sort of say, what is the relationship between them, etc., etc. You also get the topics of things like power and authority, which are different things. So power is very pervasive. It sort of exists in between people, and authority is generally seen as something that is mandated, right? So think of like power of being the standard colonizer, not a person that's actually like a colonist, not like someone who goes in with a gun and shoots people, but more the people who then move into a country to not violently overthrow anything. The violent overthrowing has already happened. They are just maintaining a system that was used, that was brought about through violence. So they're using their power, which often can be a softer power, to elevate themselves above the colonized peoples. Whereas authority would be more like, say, the police or the military that are in these areas, which then have the so-called authority to enact violence against those who would rebel against that kind of stuff. These are the sorts of ideas that can be explored in a lot of post-colonial literature, right? How do the military and the police form part of the colonizer project, and how do regular people who are not actually doing violence themselves also part of that violent system? These are important topics to explore, and they are often explored in a lot of post-colonial texts. And then also, of course, various ideas about identity, right? So race, gender, blah, 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 blah. There's so many different possible identity markers that you could look at through a post-colonial lens, right? How are different races perceived in colonized states? How are different genders perceived in different colonized states? Different ethnicities, different religions, blah, blah, blah. All of these different possible identity markers can change sort of how you are viewed in society based on whether or not you are a colonizer or a colonized, right? Think about like a country that will be, think of Africa, right? Anywhere in Africa, really, where a colonial power came in and took over, which is basically everywhere. So they would come in, right? And then they would start doing things like saying, no, your race, right, black. Because also, this is one of the things which is very insidious actually about a lot of colonialist and imperialist thought, is the idea that there's really just like a uniform African race, when there isn't. Like, there's different African peoples, just like there's different European peoples and different Asian peoples. There's no such thing as just
African person. You're like, what African person? Are they, are they Zulu? Are they Xhosa? What are they? Are they San? What are they? They are different groups, right? But you get this kind of erasure of different cultures when you try to lump people into, they're all just black or they're all just white. It sort of erases individual identities, which we tend to be much happier doing when it comes to colonized peoples. Most white people will very much be like, no, they're German or they're French, which is a specific designation of their, which you would say it's nationality, but a lot of people also see it as an ethnicity type thing, right? They're not just white, they are French white. Whereas these kinds of groups often get erased in imperialist thought, right? You'll just say, it's all just black people, it's all just African people, it's all just Asian people, when that is just nonsense, right? So your identity with your ethnicity changes depending on where you are. So if you're in, say, a colonized African country, certain races will be below others in the social hierarchy because of these violent systems that have been put into place. Gender is similar, right? Different genders have different places in different societies, different religions, right? Think about different religions that get persecuted. When you get a certain country, which, say, has a dominant religion, other religions might be seen as inferior or wrong. Not like, sometimes it's just inferior, that's one thing, but sometimes actively hunted down, right? That can happen. That happens in many, many places. People will identify you through both ethnicity and religion as a certain group that needs to be repressed or that violently ended, genocide. These kinds of things happen because of identity and how people perceive certain identities over and under others. So these are all important topics that postcolonial theatre and other forms of postcolonial literature can explore, right? Colonialism, the colonizer-colonized relationship, power, authority, identity. But how? How do they explore these things? So some of the common methods are things like the rewriting of canonized text. Now first let's just say, what is a canon? Now canon, I'm not talking about that thing that goes and shoots stuff. That's not what I'm talking about when I say the canon. Also, it's spelled differently. It has one N, not two N's. So a canon, or the canon, is the series of texts and histories and what have you that have been perceived to be of the highest quality. When you're talking about the literary canon, you will say these are the texts that are the most important texts. But who decides which texts are the most important texts? And also, isn't it quite strange that the most important texts tend to have been written by white men? Like, that's just, most of them have been written by white men. Now, there are also reasons for that. So if you say, for instance, you look at the history of, let's go at Europe, right? In Europe, the history of Europe, for most of time, poor people couldn't write or read. So that's why the oldest texts were written usually by like aristocracy or just rich people, right? Rich white men. And they were white because those were the predominant ones. Non-white people were not taught. And then also, of course, most of them were men because women, in terms of human history in Europe, have only been taught how to read and write over the last 200 years kind of thing. Like, they just weren't really taught these kind of things. And that's why you don't get those. So there are reasons that there might be fewer ancient texts by certain groups, but those reasons are not because of the imperialist and racist ideas. So the racist idea would be there's less African literature from ancient times because they're an inferior culture. That would be the racist perspective. A more realistic perspective would be to say they had an oral history which was destroyed by imperialists, and so their history, their literary history, has been destroyed. It is gone. They did not have the means to write these stories down, which is why they existed as oral histories, which have now been eradicated. So, you see, the racist thing would be to say, they're inferior. The realistic thing to say would be that it is a much more complicated situation based on imperialism, colonialism, and various just ideologies that pushed certain things down and certain things were elevated. That is just how it works. So, the rewriting of canonized texts. Okay, you're a post-colonial writer. You look at the canon and you say, okay, something in the canon will be something like Shakespeare. Right? I'm going to take a Shakespeare play and I'm going to rewrite it to criticize colonialism. I'm going to rewrite it and make all of the characters a different race so that I can comment on race. I'm going to do these kind of things. These are rewriting of canonized texts. You can do that. Same with rewriting of history. You can sort of say, well, we've lost a lot of our history, so I'm going to make my own version of a history that was taken from me. And you're going to basically make a fictionalized version of real events, or based on a real culture, or taking sort of mythology and blending it with historical realism to undermine the standard ideas that you would associate with sort of history, right? Because when you look at sort of racist, more westernized history, think about literally just think about the language that we use when we're talking about certain countries being basically found by Europeans, right? America was discovered in the late 1500s, right? America was discovered then, which, no, it wasn't. It's had Native American people have been there for hundreds of years, or thousands of years, sorry, or millions of years, whatever. They've been there for ages. America wasn't discovered in the 1500s. It was discovered by Europeans. They only became aware of it then. But the language that we use is America was discovered in this year. Australia was discovered in this year. And you're like, it's not discovered if people live there. It was already being used. It was already a place where people lived. That particular language is itself racist. To say it was discovered then, which is just saying that's when white people became aware of it. So basically, you can rewrite history, you can rewrite canonized texts to go against these ideas. You can also do things like reclaiming culture, right? Certain aspects of culture are either vilified or patronized towards, right? Look at how many people will look at certain traditional ceremonies as quaint or superstitious or silly, when then they'll look at, say, some kind of an African ritual, say a ritual dance. They'll look at that and they'll be like, oh, this is a rain dance. That's so stupid and backward and barbaric. Oh, that's so silly. They're dancing to make it rain. Okay, I'm not going to go to church and talk to the man in the sky who can hopefully stop my cancer. Why is that normal, but someone else's rituals are stupid? So if you were to reclaim sort of existing culture, you can set it as a central thing in a story, or you can make it background. You can just be like, no, it's happening in the background. It's not the central thing. It's just happening because it's normal, right? You can reclaim these things and work on them rather than conforming to the idea that they have to be forgotten or something. All right. And you also get performance through body politics. So body politics is basically, body politics is politics focusing on the body, right? Bodies have been politicized forever. Certain bodies have been seen as lesser than other bodies. So, if you want to have a theater production in which you specifically comment on something in gender politics or in body politics, you could do something like casting a black person to play a white role, casting a woman to play a male role, right? You can subvert these things through the body, through sort of saying, I'm going to go against the idea of whatever it's supposed to be, right? You could say, I'm going to have a character who is supposed to be super athletic, and I'm going to cast someone who's overweight, because I'm undermining the idea of what the original text was saying through sort of a body politics. You can do this for many different reasons. Then you also get the idea of sort of race and gender, which are common things that you can do, swapping, changing, moving it around, etc. We've kind of already gone over that. And then derogated bodies are bodies, it's also kind of body politics stuff. Derogated bodies are bodies that have been in some way seen as lesser. There's many types of bodies that have been seen as lesser. And this isn't just saying race, this is also just saying, say, people with certain disabilities or certain characteristics that are distinct from other people that have been derogated, that we've gone against for some or another reason, right? That is what derogated bodies are. So if you were to specifically take derogated bodies and put them into a theatrical production, you can undermine existing ideas about what a performance should be. So this has been a bunch of the topics that are often explored in postcolonial theatre, and the methods and why you would use those kind of methods. So postcolonialism is a very, very broad thing, and there's many different texts that can be seen as post-colonial in some or another sense. And also, like, anti-neocolonial. You know, you get a lot of, like, basically whenever you, like, watch something that's anti-capitalism, capitalism is neocolonialist. So if you are doing something that is anti-capitalist, you're basically doing post-colonial text. It would be like post-neocolonial, anti-neocolonial, you know. So it's a much more pervasive than you might originally think. It is found all over the place. So, yeah, hopefully that has been helpful, useful, whatever other words you might want to use, and that's pretty much it for today. So if you did enjoy this, or you found it beneficial, or whatever, you can support me if you so desire, either through checking out my books, or by going on Patreon. Those are more monetary ways of helping me. You can find that stuff in the description. Or you could do the like, comment, subscribe. Those are all helpful for the dumb algorithm reasons. So yeah, hopefully that has been helpful, and I hope that you have a great day, week, and month ahead. Goodbye.